Hello, everyone. Welcome to Side Stories yet again. As always, I am Aaron, and this is...
I'm Darian.
So, Darian, do you like freedom?
Yeah, freedom's pretty cool.
Freedom's cool. Do you like America?
Pretty dope place.
Well, then you're going to like today's episode, because today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite obscure founding fathers, Isaac Sears. Now, before I jump into the episode, I did want to very quickly go over what a founding father is, because there's a few different definitions that you can use of what an American founding father specifically is. So typically when you think of the founding fathers, right, we think of Washington, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, that kind of group of people. And those are all men who helped lay down the actual political framework of the United States, specific at various conventions and meetings of, Continental Congress and all that sort of thing. Well, that is obviously a founding father, right? But there's also a lot of people who were, they were solely military, or they were activist types. They weren't necessarily involved in the actual political, bedrock of the country, but they still had very important influences on America's founding. Those men can also be considered founding fathers as well. And that's who Isaac Sears is. So just wanted to let everyone know that this is not going to be talking about like his political commentary or what he did to like help ratify the Constitution, because frankly, he didn't have anything to do with that sort of thing. He was a very different kind of founding father, because he was the one who was out and about on the streets, and
he was actually doing things.
Well, yeah, he was very active in a lot of different political scenes, and he was, again, your ground level sort of founding father. And I find that very interesting, because we don't talk about those men nearly as much as the more kind of high-minded, which isn't to say that Washington and, Jefferson and all that didn't do anything. They did a lot, and they often did, get down to the more ground level sort of things, but they were kind of going up and down the entire time, whereas Isaac Sears, for the most part, stayed at his kind of level. Just wanted to get that out there. So he's a very important character in New York history as well. That's where he's from. I think a lot of people would benefit from knowing more about their actual state histories in the American Revolution, if you were part of one of the original colonies. Because again, places like North Dakota here, little early for us to jump into the history game.
Our history starts a little bit later.
Yeah, of the modern state North Dakota is a lot newer. And I also have one more quick little factoid before I go into his life story. So just wanted to note that, again, the American Revolution and the American Revolutionary War are two separate but quite obviously connected things. So
it's a good distinction to make.
Try to differentiate between those whenever it's necessary. It probably won't be that important for this episode, but I just wanted to remind everybody that the American Revolutionary War started in 1775 and lasted officially until 1783, though by that time the fighting was already pretty much non-existent by the end of the actual war. Now, the American Revolution itself started, again, people generally say sometime in the 1760s. Exact dates and the exact end of the American Revolution, if it ended according to whoever you're talking to. This is a hotly debated topic. Some people say it's still going because America as a nation still exists. Some people will say, like, as soon as the founding fathers, again, the high-minded types were, gone and passed away, it ended per se. So, again...
So think about events like the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, the reaction to the Stamp Act. Those are all parts of the American Revolution, but they all took place before the Revolutionary War.
Exactly, and those are all going to be very important events in the background of the episode we're talking about today, so I'm glad you brought up all of those things. Good job. So just wanted to double-check and make sure that everyone knew what we were talking about here, because, again, it's very easy to get lost in the weeds with so many events going on. I'm going to keep it focused on Isaac Sears himself, so you can learn more about him as a person and his exploits, and, again, what's going on in the background the broader American Revolution and later the war. So just wanted to let everyone know that's what's going on here. All right, so our man Isaac Sears, again, one of my favorite lower level founding fathers, because he has quite the interesting life. So Sears is born in 1730 in Harwich, Massachusetts. His life seems pretty normal for the first, decade or so of his life. Things are pretty much a relatively working class, colonial American family. Decently well-to-do, but not exactly rich by any means. They seem to be able to support themselves.
Upper middle class, maybe?
More like just generally middle class, I would say. They're not destitute, but they're not rich. Again, they're kind of those people in the middle in colonial America who are just making it by and doing okay for themselves. So I think it's important to remember here that Sears himself is not coming from like there's the American like upper class at this time isn't exactly full on an aristocracy by any means, but there's a lot of rich landowners, and a lot of ways they kind of style themselves after the aristocrats, but they also know there's something kind of separate. So he's not coming from a similar, upbringing as a lot of other revolutionary leaders were who are, decently well-to-do. He's coming from a different sort of world. And at the age of 16, he took an apprenticeship on a ship, so he's becoming a mariner. He quickly developed a talent for this sort of occupation, and he eventually took command of small sloops by his early 20s, so he rose through the ranks pretty quickly. And by the way, a sloop, for those of you who don't remember ye old maritime terms, a sloop is a small sailing vessel with one mast of sails, so it's typically Like, depending on the size of the sloop, they would be like your smallest sort of commercial sort of ship of war. They can perform both functions. Again, it depends on what it's built for, what it's designed for, but you'll see sloops doing a lot of different jobs at this time.
I learned to distinguish those kinds of ships playing Sid Meier's Pirates.
There you go.
Way back in the day.
See, and that, again, shows you what you can learn from the most random of sources, because that is a fairly accurate depiction of sloops in that game. Isaac himself was a commercial sailor stationed mainly out of New York City, where he eventually started his own trading firm. By 1754, the 7 Years' War broke out, which is otherwise known as the French and Indian War in colonial America. Sears saw this as a wonderful opportunity to make good use of his sailing talents in a new industry, privateering. And for those of you who remember your basic social studies, the 7 Years' War was a major part of the setup for the American Revolutionary War.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the men who fought in that war would eventually fight in the Revolutionary War, or at least some of the larger characters.
And privateering was a very fun business. It's essentially state-sanctioned pirating.
Yes, exactly. So for how ye old privateering works here, I'll give you just a very brief rundown. It's probably one of the best ways to make money at this time. You gain a government contract that lets you essentially enter into your country's navy through a private venture, so you supply your own ship. Or sometimes they would basically have, like, investors in a privateering venture. So a bunch of guys would get together, and they would help fund the purchase of a ship, and then they would actually hire a crew to go and privateer essentially in their name, or sometimes the investors would, like, crew it themselves, and then they would all split up the money as an actual, like, it's literally adventure capitalism. It was one of the...
Adventure capitalism, I like that.
I know, it's one of those exciting things that you could possibly do at the time. So in this crazy, rough and tumble world, that's what Isaac Sears is getting himself into. I don't believe he was an investor in a ship. I think he more of just... Well, I guess if he owned it, if he had a trading firm, he probably was in some way, come to think of it.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I wasn't able to find any documents on, like, the nitty-gritty details. I mean, who knows if they're even still out there.
But he also commandeered his ship.
Yes, he had his own ship, and he basically contracted it out to privateer. So he's in the early, well, I guess the colonial British Navy, technically speaking, but usually if you're a privateer, you're looked down upon by the, rank and file, sailors. And
would they be considered civilians or... they're non-civilians?
I believe they're considered combatants because they are fighting the war. They're going and raiding enemy vessels, typically like their merchant ships, because you don't want to, attack a ship of the line in a sloop, because let's say a sloop has maybe 5 to 10, probably more like 5 cannons.
If Sid Meier's Pirates taught me anything, it's that's a bad matchup.
Yeah, you don't want to go up against, like, again, when we have, like, we say things like first rate, second rate, third rate in our time, that comes from, again, old school ships of the line, like naval vessels. Those were the classes ships had. Yeah, even a third-rate vessel is going to have a lot more guns than your sloop. You don't want to fight that.
Might have like 6 to 10 guns
if you're lucky.
If they're really lucky, whereas a ship of the line could have like 50 plus.
Yeah, it's not going to be good. So they're going after the weaker vessels, is what Isaac Sears is doing. They're trying to find the ones that are loaded with basically treasure, and you want to steal from them, and you really don't want to fire any shots, because one, that's expensive, and two, you really don't want to deal with that. You just want to roll up and
repairing ships is very expensive and very time consuming.
Absolutely.
Also when you're out in the middle of the ocean, you don't really want to start taking on water.
Yeah, no. Especially at a time when most people don't know how to swim.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the world that Sears is having a lot of his later formative years in. He's like a young man. He has a company. He hires it out. So he gains a lot of experience, and he actually becomes famous for his privateering exploits.
Oh, really?
He's not just some, like, random guy who made a little money off of it. He published accounts of his actions in the newspaper, the New York Gazette, and even survived a shipwreck that left him and his crew stranded on Sable Island near Halifax, Nova Scotia, which I found out is a spot that many crews from the time found themselves wrecked on due to the island's sandbars. So this was apparently like Shipwreck Island. Like everyone ended up there at some point. So he, of course, ended up on the famous spot, I guess, due to the sandbars. They ran aground. It's like, well, they had to sit there for, I think, a few days, and they eventually got rescued. So they got relatively lucky. But again, quite the exciting adventures he had. And again, people were enamored with this story in New York City because he would write articles and people would read them. And minor celebrity, so relatively well-known. And his exploits not only won him fame, but of course, fortune as well. And he became quite wealthy, gaining approximately 2,500 British pounds in wealth for his services, which according to the inflation rates I could find online, which again, going for really old currency and trying to find the inflation rate to now over centuries is very hard. From what I can find, this would be roughly 560,000 pounds today, or about basically $750,000, 750 grand.
Not bad.
Pretty good. He did pretty well for himself for just a few short years of, again, adventure capitalism. So things were going pretty well for old Isaac Sears at this time. The post-war economic slump in the Americas once the 7-Year War ended, it hurt his business because maritime trade took a bit of a hit during that time. It was around this time also that the British started imposing various acts and taxes on the American colonies to recuperate the losses from the war. You might have heard something about this story before somewhere.
I vaguely recall maybe hearing a little bit about that at some point.
Eventually lead to one of the most important incidents in modern history, the American Revolution, but, don't quote me. So outside of the major world-changing ramifications these actions cause, or like the British acts, like Stamp Act, Tea Act, all those things, I'm not going to go over each one of those, but
you've
probably heard about
if you
those.
paid even a little bit of attention in high school history class or even before, you're familiar with.
The American colloquialism was the intolerable acts because they found them intolerable, and they eventually started fighting a war over this. So, to say the least, you probably know a little bit about that. So, on a much smaller scale, these actions, well, they hurt Isaac Sears' business. And when you mess with Isaac Sears' money, you're asking for trouble. Because he quickly joined the Sons of Liberty, again, very early American organization that basically advocated, greater autonomy for the colonies and eventually independence. You've probably heard of that before. And he set to work protesting British actions and their various acts. He took a much more direct approach than other patriots at the time. He became known for his ability to quickly form a mob to protest these things, and this earned him the title of King Sears. Now, when you hear mob, you might think that these are like inherently violent events. The term mob now has a much more violent, inherently negative connotation for good reason. But back in the day, especially at a time a lot of people didn't have the right to vote or they couldn't express themselves politically in a lot of different ways, a mob was a bit more of a venting of frustration. So, like, you would go out to, like, your local magistrate or mayor, and you would kind of protest around his house or however you wanted to basically form a group and just kind of, I guess, give your opinion about what you thought.
So a better modern word would probably be protest.
Yeah, it's more like that, though mobs, again, could get quite rowdy. That's why even back in the day, mob justice and like mob rule had very negative connotations, because you didn't want the mob to start taking over power and start being too powerful, because that's when things got out of hand and turned to riots. But if it was relatively contained and things were, controlled, and you had just a small group of people who were voicing and venting their frustrations, typically it was viewed as just a regular act of political action. Probably annoying.
Again, probably the same thing as protest today.
Yeah, again, probably viewed as annoying by the upper classes, but also, again, a way for the other people in society to actually get their voices heard, especially when a lot of them were, frankly, just locked out of political power. So he was riding the line between rabble rouser and domestic unrest, I guess. He was very good at that by also not getting into too much trouble, though, of course, things did spill over, and you'll see here why people thought that mobs were a very dangerous, volatile thing to start forming, because this rather hardline politicking of Sears got him into a number of scuffles with the British Redcoats. Again, the British soldiers at the time. The first was in 1766 when the Redcoats cut down a liberty pole. Now, liberty poles, this one might actually be something that some people don't know about, so I'll explain it real quick. These were symbols of civic resistance in the name of freedom that served as meeting places for American patriots during this time. The symbol goes all the way back to ancient Rome, and it was again popular at this time. Basically, in the early days of like the Sons of Liberty and just American, I guess, political life, long before we were independent, people would often meet underneath like spruce trees or large pine trees or things of that nature, because that's the place that everyone would know like where the biggest tree was, that sort of thing. And eventually that became the artificial liberty pole, which someone would actually put up and erect, and that would be basically a meeting point for people to discuss what was going on politically or to make plans, and just a general community center.
Was that an inspiration behind the design of the Washington Monument?
I don't believe so. I think that's more like Egyptian obelisks and all that. Yeah, maybe there's like some connection, but I've never heard of one. That's a good question. I'd like to look into that, but I would say no, just because again the obelisk is different from a liberty pole.
Right.
But there could be. It's certainly not impossible. So again, I've never thought about that. But that's a really good question, Darian. Look at you thinking.
For once.
Well, all the time. Now, again, 1766, sorry. That 10 years is a very important distinction.
Very important.
We're still in 1766 here. Isaac Sears he's meeting with some of the Sons of Liberty at a Liberty Pole, I believe in the New York City area. Now, the Redcoats have cut down the Liberty Pole because basically the Sons of Liberty and all the other patriots in the area are, again, they're rabble-rousing, they're hanging up flyers, they're criticizing the soldiers. They're really not criticizing the king, which I found interesting. They often were rather pro-King George at this time, which is an interesting distinction, but they were very much against like a lot of the British Parliament and different elements that were trying to tax them. So they're doing this sort of thing, and they're getting into various disagreements with the Redcoats. So eventually the Redcoats would come down, chop down the Liberty Pole, which Sears found none too pleasing. So he went with a group to restore the pole, right? Because, again, if you chop down someone's symbol, they want to put it back up, and then you get into a basically a sort of scuffle, which is exactly what happens because the two sides meet, and Sears is injured in this altercation. This also happened again in 1767. He had one of his most colorful adventures where he actually arrested a British soldier by himself.
Oh.
Yeah. He grabbed him by the collar. Again, it was over a Liberty pole, if I remember correctly. And he dragged him in front of the mayor. I assume this was the mayor of New York City, by the way, because that's where he's operating out of. All the stories said they dragged him in front of the mayor. It didn't exactly specify what town they were in.
Right.
But I assume since that's where he was from and operating out of, that's where he went. So he quite literally, essentially, citizens arrested the equivalent of a soldier at the time, or maybe even a civil police officer. I guess redcoats were kind of both. And
maybe like a military police sort of situation.
Sort of. Again, they
So
didn't have as many distinctions and departments as we do now.
yeah, it would be like a colonial
officer.
Yeah.
Best way to describe it. And again, he's a citizen. He has grabbed this man by his collar and brought him in front of the mayor of New York City, which will never happen again. No one will ever grab an NYPD officer and drag them in front of the New York City mayor. That's never going to happen ever again. This
Probably
is
not.
just how wild the times were. From what I understand, the mayor was just kind of like slightly aghast by this, but I believe he told the redcoats to stand down because he knew things were just getting way out of hand if people are now being citizens arrested and tossed in front of him just in his office.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I can't quite do justice how all the sources seem to just very casually say, yeah, he just tossed this guy basically into his office. That's how they're all written. Again, I don't know if that's exactly how it happened, but they all seem to imply that he just threw him in there randomly. Because I guess you could just walk into the mayor's office whenever you wanted at the time. Again, things like this just don't happen anymore.
Or yeah, I suppose, like even if there are several barriers to entry into the mayor's office, if you see a civilian dragging a red coat, you're probably not going to put up too much of a fight.
Yeah, probably. At that point, I think you've lost any sort of political advantage or leverage you have.
Yeah, if I'm like a doorman or a secretary, I'm going to think this is probably an issue for the mayor.
Yeah, he's upstairs. Go talk to him.
Yeah.
I'm not dealing with this. Probably something that history has lost, but I wouldn't doubt if there was a secretary working at the time. Almost assuredly what they thought.
Yeah.
So now that leads us to the Battle of Golden Hill, which is one of the most colorful incidents in Isaac Sears' entire political career. So this is going to be another fight with British redcoats and the Sons of Liberty and I guess you'd call it a Liberty mob over a Liberty pole, though of course it's going to spiral into a larger incident. This is 6 weeks before the Boston Massacre as well, so keep that in mind as I tell you the story here. Because the Boston Massacre is usually remembered as the first bloodshed of the American Revolution. That's not entirely true, though it is the first deaths of the American Revolution. So as we're going through here, just, again, keep that in the back of your mind. So the Battle of Golden Hill starts with, again, there's a lot of anti-British and specifically anti-redcoat sentiment spreading around the entirety of New York and a lot of the colonies right now. Isaac Sears is, of course, right there, and he's rabble rousing, doing his regular thing. He's formed a mob and talking to people around the Liberty Pole. The British cut it down. The mob comes back trying to put it back up. Now the British are, out in force, and they're trying to, basically send people away in a sort of police action. So the mob continues to grow due to that, and it starts to get out of hand very quickly. Some of the mob have clubs and cutlasses. Again, these are actual weapons. Things are getting very tense here. And the mob retreats to basically a wheat-covered hill called Golden Hill, and that's where they're trying to regroup after they get chased away from the pole. The British come back, and they rush the mob with basically a bayonet charge. And so that draws a lot of blood. Luckily, no one dies, which is frankly a miracle given how armed people are at this incident. And this devolves into essentially a hostage situation where, again, Isaac takes a few of the redcoats hostage. There's a negotiation process, and eventually they're released. The details on that are a little bit murky from what I found in the sources, but essentially things are able to be diffused with no deaths. So it's not a battle. It's called the Battle of Golden Hill because it's kind of a street fight almost.
It's more of a kerfuffle.
Yeah, it's not like there's not line infantry shooting at each other. This isn't like the American Revolutionary War battles. This is a precursor to that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not the first battle by any means, but it is potentially some of the first bloodshed. Because again, people are hit with bayonets and clubs and all that. And again, luckily, no one dies, but 6 weeks later, the Boston Massacre is going to go down. And then we're very much on the true path to the revolution once that happens because it's much more publicized. But Battle of Golden Hill is very important, especially for New York history, and a lot of the redcoat, anti-British Parliament sentiment starts to grow a lot after this incident. So Sears keeps on doing his, regular activities for the next few years. By 1774, he's openly advocating armed revolution against the British to form an independent state. So he's a little bit early on that train. People have been talking about that for a while, but he basically does it a whole year before Lexington and Concord happen, which eventually gets a lot more people basically on that wagon because they realize there's no going back now. He's watching the events unfold. And again, his life is a really interesting kind of I guess you put him under the microscope, you can kind of see a small version of the American Revolution playing out because he's at a lot of these very important events. And he's on multiple committees that are protesting the British still. And eventually, once the war starts, he attempts to get a naval commission. I don't really know why they don't give him one, them being the Continental Congress. Because he has a lot of experience. He's a rich mariner. He's definitely been a privateer before. He's basically trying to become a privateer again, or I guess if it's a commission, this is technically more of a proper naval command. They don't give it to him for some reason. I don't know if he just doesn't have the right connections or he doesn't have the proper, like, true naval experience. But wanting to play a part in the revolution, he goes into the army. He served underneath Charles Lee. He becomes, I believe, an adjunct general for Charles Lee. So he's relatively high up in, like, a command position. Though they don't renew his commission, even though he has experience leading militias, and he does that pretty well during the war from what I can find in the early phases. So especially at a time when they need people who know what they're doing, they seem to pass over him for some reason.
Seems like there was something strange going on there.
Yeah, I wish I knew more. I tried to look at the sources, but there's no, like, big disasters as far as I can tell that he's a part of, so it seems like he just kind of faded through the cracks for whatever reason.
Think there's anyone that he had bad blood with in the Congress?
Not that I can tell. I mean, it's certainly possible, but there is no one I've found that was like a political rival that was, anti-Sears. I mean, maybe they thought he was too hot-headed or something, but I mean, he didn't have any major screw-ups from what I can tell, so maybe he just didn't have the right connections. But not wanting to sit out on the sidelines, he goes back to his old adventure capitalist ways, and he privateers yet again. He seems to do pretty well with that. He makes probably a decent amount of money, and he serves his country well, and eventually the Americans win the war, so that's his time in the military. Again, a lot of it seems to be like he makes it a little ways, they stop, and he tries to go a little bit further. They stop him for whatever reason. Like, he probably could have been a much more important military player had he been allowed to actually rise through ranks and get somewhere. But he seems undercut at every turn. So he goes back to privateering, which is, again, basically being a legal pirate or mercenary. He's good in that. So he does pretty well for himself. And then, interestingly, after the war, he has a very interesting idea, right? Because this is where his life story is going to end here. And so after the war, he's still looking for, like, adventures and getting himself out there. And he's in this brand new country that he played a part in founding. So life's pretty good. He decides that there is a great opportunity to start an American trade with China. So he sails out over there, and he is this is during the 1780s, because again, the war ends 1783. I believe he dies in 1786, if the dates are correct here. So a few years later, he's about to set off to China, and he's going to, make, a whole bunch of riches there and open up trade to the Chinese, and it's going to be great, right? He's really thinking ahead there. Unfortunately, he contracts a fever and dies at sea while en route to China in October. And he's actually buried on an island in Canton Harbor, so he is perhaps the only American founding father buried in China.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
I know, right? A lot of people don't know anything about that. I don't know if he has, like, a grave marker or anything like that. I'm not sure how well marked it is, but that's where he was buried, so he's there somewhere.
Huh.
I guess I should double check sometime and see if there is, but I didn't find anything online. But maybe there's something I missed. If not, let me know. We do have a Twitter account and all that. So yeah, that's pretty much the end of his story there. I don't have really much to add, I guess. Do you have any questions about him? Do you feel like you learned something today, Darian?
Yeah, I definitely learned a lot about him. I really knew nothing at all about him before this.
Yeah, he's one of my favorite obscure founding fathers. In fact, actually, I just remembered, I was almost going to end the episode without talking about this, but I wanted to talk about how I found out about him, because it is a very strange connection to a video game franchise. And it's not a historical one like you might think, like, oh, maybe he was mentioned in some, like, game about the American Revolution. No. Of all games, I believe there are strong references to Isaac Sears in Metal Gear Solid 2.
Really?
Which I'll remind you, the subtitle of that game is Sons of Liberty. And a lot of that has a lot of the background of this game. I do not have the time to explain the plot of Metal Gear Solid 2, okay? It is known as one of the most hyper-complicated video games ever. But I will try to distill this for everyone who has not played it in the simplest way possible. Again, the game is called Sons of Liberty. There is a faction in the game led by a former U.S. president whose name is George Sears. And his code name is, that's Solid Snake in the game.
Yep.
Which, if you heard of Solid Snake from Metal Gear Solid, that's where that comes from. That's his brother. Again, long story. But his other code name is King Sears, right? Part of the Sons of Liberty, King Sears. And his whole goal is basically an uprising against the leaders of, like, the shadow government of the United States. And his plan is to make New York City independent. So New York City, his organization is called the Sons of Liberty. He's got a sort of populist rhetoric going on that we need to be independent from these overlords. Again, he's good at, which is basically like a mob. It's, again, King Sears, Sons of Liberty, New York City. I started reading about Isaac Sears, I don't remember exactly how I found it. I think I looked up King Sears one day because I was curious where that code name came from. Like, why is he called King in the game? And I found the actual real life story of Isaac Sears. So it's like, wait, is George Sears Isaac Sears? Like, is this a reference?
Seems to be pretty strong reference.
I know, right? And I was so stunned by this because everything seems to fit so well, and yet, as far as I know, no one on like the development team of Metal Gear Solid 2 has ever like talked about that. Maybe they just haven't been asked because he's a pretty obscure founding father, but again, it's very strange to me that there's such... If it's a coincidence, it's a heck of a coincidence. It really is.
It seems a little too... It seems like everything connects too well to be a coincidence, though.
Yeah. By the way, this game is so New York inspired that there's actually a speech given at the end of the game by, again, George Sears, Solid as Snake. He gives a speech about like the founding of America, and the final boss fight is at Federal Hall in New York City, and he waxes poetic about George Washington, the American Revolution. It's like, that's gotta be. Because if they're doing this research into the American Revolution to make this speech make sense, and they have like the historical like Sons of Liberty flag appears in the game, it's like, they had to have known about Isaac Sears then, right?
Almost positive.
They had to have used some of this story as inspiration for this character. And it's so crazy to me that no one talks about this. So I feel like I've blown the whistle on this now. Everyone will know after this. So that's how I found out about Isaac Sears. That's how I discovered him. Very interesting, obscure founding father. Again, very different character than what is normally talked about in the Revolution, but I think also very important to learn about because, as I was saying, he's like a microscope slide on the American Revolution. Like if you're looking at it, at a very specific way, looking through the story of one person, he's interesting to follow because he goes through all of the main phases of the revolution up into the war and then actually survives the entire war, and he's in the early American Republic. So you can follow all of his life story. It's kind of like, I guess, what's the best way to describe this? It's an American story. He lives an American life, even though he's born in the colonies, he sees independence, he dies after independence. He lives, I guess, kind of like a microcosm of the early American spirit. So it's really interesting to see.
He's a really fascinating guy.
I know he is, and hopefully you've all appreciated learning about him. Again, one of my favorite founders, and has a seemingly bizarre connection to Metal Gear Solid 2 of all video games. And again, I'm sorry if you've never played that game and what I just explained to you sounds crazy. It is. It's completely bizarre. So yeah, just so you know, it's hard to explain, but hopefully the real history is interesting, and he has a mark on pop culture. That's something. There you go. Again, anything else you wanted to ask about, or you got anything else to add, Darian?
No.
Nope. All right. Seems like a good place to end it. We'll see you all in the next one. Thank you for listening, and have a great day. And pour one out for our man Isaac Sears if you want to. Live free, or live free or die, Darian. I don't know. Just wanted to say that. I'm sorry. My blood is red, white, and blue. I'm so darn American. I don't have DNA. I have USA.
That sounds like a medical condition. You should probably get that checked out.
Oh, you shush. I'm just American. All right. Catch you later.
Bye.